I would, just before I introduce her, need to thank some people, some foundations. So first, the Kane College of the Arts Visiting Artists and Scholars Series, which is underwritten by the Marie Eccles Kane Foundation, Russell Family, the Tanner Charitable Trust, and differential tuition provided by you, students in the college. So our speaker this evening, Dr. Aruna D'Souza, is a writer whose work focuses on modern and contemporary art, intersectional feminisms, globalism, cultural critique, and, in her words, how museums shape our views of each other and the world. She is the author of Cezanne's Bathers, Biography in the Erotics of Paint, published by Penn State in 2008, and has co-edited several volumes, most recently Art History in the Wake of the Global Turn, published by Yale in 2014. Her writings on contemporary art have appeared in exhibition catalogs, as well as publications such as the Wall Street Journal, Art News, Huffington Post, Book Forum, Art in America, and Time Out New York, and the list could go on from there. She is a regular contributor to the online art magazine 4columns.org and is working on a volume of collected essays about art and politics by the eminent feminist art historian Linda Nochlin, who also served as her doctoral advisor at the Institute of Fine Arts at New York University. In addition, Dr. D'Souza writes the popular food blog, Kitchen Flânerie, which is where I learned how to make preserved lemons years ago. So on that note, please join me in welcoming Dr. Aruna D'Souza.
Hi. The title that I supplied for today's talk was The Freedom on Art Protests and Museums in 2017. But really I'm talking about one museum and one protest, just so that I don't overwhelm you. And I want to start with the protest and not the painting, in part because there was so much noise around what the protesters said, what they wanted, what they demanded, that it is easy to write off their words as unreasonable. So in the spirit of what I've come to realize is my core belief as a writer about art and as a human being in the world, that people are more important than art, let's start with the people. This is what Hannah Black wrote to the curators of the 2017 Whitney Biennial. Christopher Liu and Mia Laux were the curators, in response to their decision to include Dana Schutz's painting Open Casket in their show. To the curators of the Whitney Biennial, I'm writing to ask you to remove Dana Schutz's painting Open Casket, and with the urgent recommendation that the painting be destroyed and not entered into any market or museum. As you know, this painting depicts the dead body of 14-year-old Emmett Till in the open casket that his mother chose, saying, "Let the people see what I've seen." That even the disfigured corpse of a child was not sufficient to move the white gaze from its habitual cold calculation is evident daily and in myriad of ways, not least the fact that this painting exists at all. In brief, the painting should not be acceptable to anyone who cares or pretends to care about Black people, because it is not acceptable for a white person to transmute Black suffering into profit and fun through the practice, though the practice has been normalized for a long time. Although Schutz's intention may be to present white shame, this shame is not correctly represented as a painting of a dead Black boy by a white artist. Those non-Black artists who sincerely wish to highlight the shameful nature of white violence should first of all stop treating Black pain as raw material. The subject matter is not Schutz's. White free speech and white creative freedom have been founded on the constraints of others and are not natural rights. The painting must go. Emmett Till's name has circulated widely since his death. It has come to stand not only for Till himself, but also for the mournability to each other, if not to everyone, of people marked as disposable, for the weight so often given to a white woman's word above a black child's comfort or survival, and for the injustice of an anti-black legal system. Through his mother's courage, Till was made available to black people as an inspiration and a warning. Non-black people must accept that they will never embody and cannot understand this gesture. The evidence of their collective lack of understanding is that black people go on dying at the hands of white supremacists, that black communities go on living in desperate poverty not far from the museum where this valuable painting hangs, that black children are still denied childhood. Even if Schutz has not been gifted with any real sensitivity to history, if black people are telling her that the painting has caused unnecessary hurt, she and you must accept the truth of this. The painting must go. Ongoing debates on the appropriation of black culture by non-black artists have highlighted the relation of these appropriations to the systematic oppression of black communities in the U.S. and worldwide, and, in a wider historical view, to the capitalist appropriation of the lives and bodies of black people with which our present era begins. Meanwhile, a similarly high-stakes conversation has been going on about the willingness of a largely non-black media to share images and footage of black people in torment and distress, or even at the moment of death, evoking deeply shameful white American traditions such as the public lynching. Although derided by many white and white-affiliated critics as trivial and naive, discussions of appropriation and representation go to the heart of the question of how we might seek to live in a reparative mode with humility, clarity, humor, and hope, given the barbaric realities of racial and gendered violence on which our lives are founded. I see no more important foundational consideration for art than this question, which otherwise dissolves into empty formalism or irony, into a pastime or therapy. The curators of the Whitney Biennial surely agree, because they have staged a show in which black life and anti-black violence feature as themes, and have been approvingly reviewed in major publications for doing so. Although it is possible that this inclusion means no more than that blackness is hot right now, driven into non-black consciousness by prominent black uprisings and struggles across the U.S. and elsewhere, I choose to assume as much capacity for insight and sincerity in the biennial curators as I do in myself, which is to say, we all make terrible mistakes sometimes, but through effort, the more important thing could be how we move to make amends for them and what we learn in the process. The painting must go. Thank you for reading. That letter was signed by Hannah Black, an artist and a writer, along with 47 other artists, writers, and arts professionals. Open Casket was one piece among many in this showcase of American art. The Whitney Biennial happens every 2 years, and it really purports to take the temperature of the American art world. And it's one of the most anticipated and celebrated art world events. But in many ways, its presence, the presence of the painting, came to define the biennial this year. More than that, it became a site, a node, a nexus of an ongoing, never-resolved conversation. Conversation might not be the right word here. Maybe we should speak of it as a wound, perhaps, one that never heals, around the place of blackness in the museum. Open Casket was tucked away in a back gallery, wedged between one of the best pieces in the exhibition, a piece by an artist named Maya Stovall called Liquor Store Theater, which were videos of her and her friends staging ballets in front of liquor stores in black neighborhoods in Chicago, and a dark curtain leading into another room in which videos by the collective Post Commodity were being shown. For the first 2 weeks or so of the biennial, the performance artist Parker Bright stationed himself in the room, often placing himself between viewers and open casket, wearing a t-shirt that said Black Death Spectacle and answering questions from curious museum goers as to the reasons for his protest. He was one of the signatories of Hannah Black's letter. Black's letter went viral on social media, and my virtual world, a world of artists, art historians, critics, curators, museum professionals of all sorts, was roiled by debate around the painting and the protests. As with so many social media events of its kind, nuance was somewhat flattened, with the arguments focusing on the following questions. So these are the 3 questions that I think were generally raised in these debates. First, was Open Casket based on one of the most significant photographic traces of the civil rights era? It was really a photograph that kickstarted a lot of the marches, a lot of the massive protest that led to civil rights legislation. So was this photograph fair game as subject matter for a white artist, or was it an inappropriate appropriation of Black history? Should certain subject matters be off limits for artists based on their race or gender or other matters of identity? So that was one of the questions. Another one was Hannah Black's urgent recommendation that the painting be taken down and destroyed a form of censorship, an attack on artistic freedom based on specious and essentialist identity politics? And what of Parker Bright's protest? Was that a form of censorship or suppression of artistic freedom? And what of the thousands of people calling for redress in one way or another on social media? And the third big question, I think, was whose fault was the controversy, and at whose doorstep should the blame be laid? Was it Dana Schutz's for making and showing the painting? Was it the protesters for attacking Schutz's artistic freedom? Was it the curators for including it in the show? The context of this painting's presentation was a major factor in the speed with which the outrage spread on social media. The biennial is always controversial, and why should we expect any different, given that it has claimed since 1973 to take the temperature of a nation through its art? When you have an exhibition that purports to present a snapshot of the American art scene, who gets included, and more importantly, who gets left out, is bound to raise hackles. This is especially so when it comes to matters of diversity. In recent years, many Black artists have started referring to the museum as the Whitney instead of the Whitney, to reflect its poor track record when it comes to including artists of color in its programming. The 2014 biennial included, out of about 118 artists, only 9 Black artists, and only about a third of the artists were women. That same year, the participation of Donnell Wolford, a Black woman artist who turned out to be the alter ego of a white man, Joe Scanlon, left a bad taste in the mouths of many, including the Yams Collective, which withdrew their work in protest because they felt the museum hadn't done enough to address concerns about this piece. So this is Donnell Wolford's biography, which was, in fact, the creation of this white guy, Joe Scanlon. The 2017 biennial also came on the heels of the museum's just completed move to the meatpacking district, which was accompanied by a new commitment to cultivate and work with new audiences, especially those under threat by the neighborhood's rapid gentrification, a process that would only be exacerbated by the Whitney's presence there. With this in mind, the museum appointed 2 people, Christopher Liu, a member of the Whitney's own curatorial team, and Mia Locks, an independent curator, both Asian American, to create what it would bill as the most diverse Whitney biennial ever. And indeed it was. There were 30-plus artists of color and 30-plus women included among the 63 artists and groups included, an extraordinary statistic, one that comes close to the actual breakdown of each category in the U.S. population. Lou and Locks were extremely conscious, too, of the historical moment at which the show was happening. With the recent inauguration of Donald Trump as president, after a campaign marked by extreme misogyny and overt white supremacist rhetoric, with increasing numbers of anti-immigrant and xenophobic violence happening in the country, and in the shadow of police murders of black men and women that had led to the rise of Black Lives Matter and other anti-racist activism, the stakes were high. Throughout our research and travel, we've been moved by the impassioned discussions we had about recent tumult in society, politics, and the economic system. It's been unavoidable as we met with artists, fellow curators, writers, and other cultural producers across the United States and beyond, Lou said in a museum statement. Mia Locks noted, against this backdrop, many of the participating artists are asking probing questions about the self and the social and where those two things intersect. How do we think and live through these lenses, and where do they fall short? So I was working as a consultant for the Whitney during this period. This was totally coincidental. From October 2016 to June 2017, I held monthly sessions with the members of the museum's education department, discussing with them issues around diversity and inclusion, structural racism, and strategies for making change at an institution. The department, which is responsible for cultivating new and underrepresented audiences, working with students in school groups, running the internship programs, curating public programs for both general and specialized audiences, writing wall labels and creating other interpretive materials, and so on, is one of the most diverse and energetic in the museum. They really are an extraordinary group of people. While we had expected my time with them to be mostly involved with reading critical race theory and discussing abstract ideas, with November's election, the inauguration, and then the biennial controversy, plans changed. I ended up, as I joked, being their race whisperer. I talked with them a lot about navigating their difficult position, having to help shape a programmatic response to the protests, while at the same time being privately frustrated and even critical of the institution's leadership on the controversy. What I can assure you is this. There's lots of things I can't say about that work, but what I can say is that of all the works that were included in the Whitney Biennial this year, no one at the museum anticipated that Dana Schutz's casket would be the work that generated controversy. It was not on the radar. Far from it. After all, the painting had been shown some short while earlier in Berlin to little incident, and Schutz is widely acknowledged as a critical and market darling, one of the wonderkins of the Columbia University MFA program, the kind of artist who had her first solo show at a major New York gallery lined up before she even graduated. Instead, people expected that it would be William Pope L's claim, which you're seeing on the screen, that would garner complaint, not least because of its pungent smell. Pope L's installation, with its Pepto-Bismol pink walls covered with slices of bologna, onto which were printed faces claimed to represent the proportion of Jewish people in New York City, although both the title of the work and the material itself suggested that the conceit was bologna, was thought to be the work that would rankle. Museum employees wondered whether the African-American artist Pope L's decision to focus on Jews in this strange and difficult-to-read installation would raise hackles. In fact, it ended up being one of the most well-received pieces in the show, and Pope L was just awarded. The Whitney gives out a $100,000 artist prize for the sort of best in show at the biennial, and he just received that prize last week or the week before. When the controversy around Open Casket erupted, the Whitney's response was typical corporate crisis management, which was, I think, part of the problem. Everyone knew that they were being handled by a PR firm. For the most part, at first at least, the institution kept fairly tight-lipped, hoping the storm would pass quickly. Parker Bright and his supporters were allowed to perform in the gallery unmolested, and the museum put out the usual press statement citing its commitment to show work that grappled with the most difficult issues, the inevitability of disagreement, the unquestionable right of the artist to paint whatever she wanted, and the value of advanced art to generate conversation about sensitive issues. Where this conversation was going to take place, or what the Whitney's role in that conversation was going to be, was left for the moment unsaid. Free speech and the need to have difficult conversations. These are the inarguable values, aren't they? Especially in a country where we seem to have lost the ability to listen to different points of view and across the chasm of our political divides. And yet, as many of the protesters of the painting would argue in Facebook posts and Twitter screeds, those rights and responsibilities were unevenly dispersed by the museum. The right to free speech conferred on Dana Schutz and propped up by the resources of one of the most influential and wealthy art institutions of the country was balanced against the protesters, and so the difficult conversations were relegated to outside the institution, to the space of protest, right? While the Whitney and its curators kept a relatively low profile during the scandal, Schutz herself attempted to speak several times about her decision to make and show the painting. It was made in August 2016, she explained in a revised wall label for the show. After a long, violent, and I'm quoting here, after a long, violent summer of mass shootings, rallies filled with hate speech, and an ever-escalating number of black men being shot execution-style by police, recorded with camera phones as witness. In that state, she began thinking about Emmett Till, another young black man who was the victim of state-sanctioned violence, a lynching. This is Emmett Till's mother. I don't know what it is like to be black in America, Schutz's statement continued, but I do know what it is like to be a mother. Emmett was Mamie Till Mobley's only son. I thought about the possibility of painting it only after listening to the interviews with her. In her sorrow and rage, she wanted her son's death not to just be her pain, but America's pain. Schutz's statement, if anything, fanned the flame of the outrage rather than quelled it. I should say here that from what I could see, and I was watching the debates pretty closely and in the middle of many of them, the reactions to Schutz's painting broke down along multiple axes and for a variety of reasons, not always, as one might have thought, according to race. Certainly, there were some positions that could be mapped according to black and white. The reaction to Schutz's statement of her intentions was one. For many sympathetic white observers, struggling themselves with trying to make sense of an unresolved history of racial violence in this country, Schutz's attempt to put herself in the shoes of Mamie Till, to imagine herself looking down at her own child mutilated in his casket, was an act of empathy, a matter of trying to understand the terror under which black Americans lived, and sometimes still live. For her critical black detractors, Schutz's statement was a way of centering herself and her feelings, her white tears, as some would say derisively, no matter the cost, in this case, the cost of upsetting black viewers for whom Till was anything but historical. And you'll have noticed from Hannah Black's letter that that's one of the things that I think she brings out, is the way in which this is a very real lived experience still for many black people, not a historical artifact. While many parents of all backgrounds may have moments where they think, Tamir Rice was my child's age, right, as Obama famously spoke of Rice and Trayvon Martin and others, Many parents may have that feeling and feel a pang of empathy and outrage. The fact is that for most Americans, the possibility that our children might be killed in the street because of the color of their skin is an abstraction. For black mothers and fathers, it's a legitimate daily fear. Moreover, Schutz's statement referred to the fact that in the summer of 2016, quote, there was renewed attention to the brutal murder and mutilation of Emmett Till, end quote. She said that in her statement. The reason, though, for this renewed attention that she didn't mention in her statement, the reason that everyone was talking about Emmett Till in the summer of 2016 is because the adult woman who had accused Till of flirting with her, Carolyn Bryant, who you see on the far left, her husband, Ray Bryant, is in the middle, I believe, and brother-in-law on the far left. Carolyn Bryant, who had accused Till of flirting with her, had admitted to a reporter that she had lied all those many years ago. Till didn't catcall her, but he died based on her false accusation. Schutz's decision to paint this work from the position of the bereaved Black mother, rather than explore the question of white America's complicity with the white false accuser, was seen by many as tone-deaf. At best, a missed opportunity to actually understand what Emmett Till's death means for white America, and at worst, a narcissistic act as positioning herself as victim, just like Mamie Till of American racism. When it came to questions of free speech and its foil, censorship, however, the dividing lines were drawn quite differently. For it was often Black artists and writers of a certain generation, those who came into prominence in the late 80s and early 90s, a previous iteration of our endless American culture wars, who raised the specter of censorship when talking about the protests against Schutz's painting. The most vocal of these critics was Coco Fusco, who posted an article on the blog Hyperallergic that went viral, garnering almost 200,000 views, which is pretty remarkable for an article about contemporary art, which basically very few people actually care about. So it was incredibly widespread. Fusco, who happened to be one of Schutz's teachers at Columbia, countered a number of arguments that had been made in published form and on social media, including my own, in her article, and continued asserting her position on Facebook, including on my threads, which became the site of spectacular debate, and I have the scars to prove it. For Fusco, the stakes were twofold. First, as an artist who was alongside people like David Hammons, Kara Walker, Jimmy Durham, and others, fighting the insistent essentializing of the art world in the 1980s and 90s, the propensity of writers and curators to imagine that artists of color were only useful for their ability to speak to issues of race, to perform a kind of racialized authenticity, Fusco firmly rejected the idea that there were some subject matters that were off limits to white artists on the basis of their identities, right? So just as she would have said in the 1990s, as a Black artist, I shouldn't only be expected to make art about Black issues. She was saying now, in 2017, you can't tell white artists that they can't make paintings of Black history. Second, as an artist who witnessed the trials of the so-called NEA 5, artists working with feminist, queer, and other anti-establishment themes, whose National Endowment for the Arts grants were withdrawn because of protests from conservative Republican lawmakers, and who had watched the Corcoran cancel and the Cincinnati Art Center shut down an exhibition of Robert Mapplethorpe photographs in the early 90s, any call to remove works, no matter who was making it, was just beyond the pale. Though the controversy over Open Casket may have seemed a traumatic repetition of those early 1990s incidents of censorship to Fusco and to other artists of that generation, including Kara Walker, Kara notably took to Instagram to express in an oblique way her solidarity with Schutz by posting this picture of Samson and Delilah, the Gentileschi picture. There was a crucial difference. where in the early 1990s, the attacks on artistic freedom were coming from the US government, especially in the form of withdrawal of grants from individual artists and threats to get rid of the National Endowment for the Arts in its entirety, as well as in the form of actual prosecution of curators and museum directors for showing work that was deemed to be obscene, as in the case of the Cincinnati Art Center's attempts to show Robert Mapplethorpe's photographs. The Whitney Biennial protests were coming from individuals. Not just individuals, but particularly powerless individuals in the scheme of things. These were all, to a letter, young, Black artists, critics, independent curators, writers, people who did not have any form of institutional power behind them, let alone the power of the state. I'm leaving aside for the moment the fact that in technical terms, the constitutional right to freedom of speech is only a freedom in relation to government repression of speech. We are not free in this country from being shouted down by our countrymen and countrywomen. But I do believe that we can see censorship beyond those very strict constitutional terms, as long as we are careful to think about the power relations of a given situation. In the case of Dana Schutz, she had a huge platform. As one of the most critical and commercially successful painters on the scene at the moment, showing work in one of the most watched exhibitions of contemporary art in the US at a major museum. And she was defended by the Whitney, which, as soon as the protests looked like they weren't going to stop, and in keeping with its long-standing policy when it came to protests around its exhibitions, made clear that it would not consider removing the work, period. That work was not going to go anywhere. The censorship debates were, quite frankly, the most galling to me, because they seemed to fixate in an almost hysterical fashion on Black's urgent recommendation that the painting be destroyed. Now, a recommendation isn't a demand, and the passive voice with reference to its destruction, the painting be destroyed as opposed to someone destroy the painting, that passive voice was, I believe, a very carefully chosen one. Black is an extremely accomplished writer and is a careful writer, as was Black's repeated refrain that the painting must go, a phrase whose vagueness left open a range of options for the curators and the artist, short of keeping the painting on display. But worse than that, the fixations on this, the taking literally of the painting must be destroyed, as if Hannah Black and Parker Bright were going to come into the museum and actually physically destroy the painting, as if the protesters had the power to destroy the painting. This taking literally of this call seemed to justify, for many, ignoring the questions of Black pain, the uses and abuses of history, and reparative justice that the rest of the letter raised. So because they read that phrase, you could ignore the rest of the letter. But more than that, it occluded the ways in which Dana Schutz's free speech, as such, was never the issue. Schutz's painting was chosen for inclusion in the exhibition, while many, many other artworks were not chosen. This curatorial act is not a form of censorship in that the works that were not chosen to be included were not suppressed, but it is a form of what some now refer to as platforming, or you may have heard the term in its opposite, no platforming, of giving certain speech acts, or in this case artworks, a platform and not giving a platform to others. By protesting her inclusion, critics were not really protesting her right to make her painting, whether they put it in those terms or not. They were protesting the museum's decision to give her painting a prime public platform. This is not so different, say, from people who protest neo-Nazi speakers on their campuses. The question they are addressing is not whether neo-Nazis should have the right to spread their hate, but whether colleges should provide the means for them to do so, right? And so many on the left would see that those protests were a form of no platforming, saying you can say what you want, but I am not going to participate in giving you a platform to say it. Right? And this is what I think was at the heart of the protests against the Dana Schutz painting. On the other hand, the protesters were not given a platform. They were only allotted a space of protest. Even the programs that the museums organized in order to make gestures towards those difficult conversations that they stated would be the productive byproduct of the controversy, including an event co-organized by Claudia Rankine's Racial Imaginary Institute, were so stage managed by the museum that those in the audience and watching online, and there were actually Facebook watching parties, believe it or not, saw them as yet another PR move rather than a sincere attempt to listen to criticism and concerns. I have avoided speaking of the painting specifically up until now, in part because for many people taking part in the heated online debates, most had not yet seen the painting. They were seeing the context, the history of that institution, of the Whitney, and its track record when it came to race, the statements put out by museum curators, artists, and articles supportive and outraged by people who knew the work. Hannah Black, who is a British citizen based in Berlin, had in fact seen the painting when it was shown there some months earlier. To a lot of art worlders, the fact that so many people rendering an opinion on this painting without having seen it rendered much of this critique and protest invalid. For what is worse than condemning an artwork that one has not even seen in the flesh? But of course, this presupposes that the problem of the painting had to do with aesthetics, that it was a painting with bad politics redeemed by excellent technique, say, or a painting with good politics that was simply terribly executed. But what if, and this is what I've been arguing here more or less, what if the outrage over the painting had nothing to do with the painting itself? Or if the painting was merely symptomatic of a much larger decay in our public sphere, having to do with questions of who is allowed to claim the freedom of expression and who isn't. So this is a detail of the head of Emmett Till from Open Casket. And what you can't see from slides is that it's a work, it's not very big, it's about 53 by 39 inches. It is painted, as with all of Schutz's work, with a very expressive, brushy, kind of luscious sort of surface. Her paintings are beautifully colored. They are, the paint sort of seems to just glide across the surface. They're very seductive, all of her works. And this is no different. But this painting, what's interesting is she actually built up the head, and I don't know why it never shows up in any image I've seen of this painting. She built up the head with cardboard. So if you stand from the side, you're actually seeing that the head and the face is actually bulges out from the surface of the painting. And she spent most of her painterly energy on this head and this face. The face that you saw in one of the earlier slides that was swollen and disfigured and mutilated beyond recognition as even a human body part. And she spent a lot of time with her brush on this face, on this head. And I think that is one of the reasons why people found the argument about this painting and the act of painting this as a form of empathy so hard to swallow, in fact. Because for them, for many people, Mamie Till's decision to leave the casket open was a decision for America not to, and I'll use a charged metaphor, not to paint over the reality of lynching in the US. And so that this was a literal act of painting over this face. And what's worse is, if you think about how we interpret painting, we often interpret expressionism in painting as a set of signs that usually have to do with brushy brushwork and sort of rapid painting and a certain kind of thickness of the paint and a sense of immediacy that you get, we interpret that as an artist's expression, right? As an expressive act. And that by focusing all of the expressive energy on the face, it turned this painting of this into an act of narcissism. The face now becomes a sign of Dana Schutz's artistic brilliance, right? Rather than a sign, as Mamie Till would have it, by insisting on the open casket, by insisting that photographs be taken of Emmett Till, by insisting that those photographs be published nationally, a sign of American history. Right, and so that was one of the, I think, the major problems that happened within the aesthetic terms of the painting itself. So forget the context. What about the painting? When I started posting about this painting online, Dawood Bey, who's an African-American photographer who just yesterday, it was announced, won MacArthur Genius Award. For his long-time work documenting Black experience and life in the U.S. He's a quite brilliant photographer. He got on my case, and he said, but Aruna, what about this other painting that took place, that was hung in the biennial? And that is Henry Taylor's painting on the right, which depicts the shooting of Philando Castile. Right, shot by police officers while he was in his car, while his girlfriend and his child were in his car, and he was unarmed and it had been stopped for a broken light or something like that. Henry Taylor is Black. And so the question was posed, and I think rightly so, what's the difference between Schutz, a white woman, painting Emmett Till, and Henry Taylor painting Philando Castile? Is it simply that Henry Taylor's race gives him a free pass, where Dana Schutz's race makes this sort of similar subject matter off limits? And I've thought about this a lot, and I think the answer has to do with who Henry Taylor is, not just as a person, as a Black artist, but as an artist who has engaged, and in his presentation at the Whitney Biennial, engaged in the depiction of Black life as a whole. Henry Taylor, his work was shown in a room alongside photographs, interspersed with photographs by an artist with whom he often collaborates, the photographer Deanna Lawson. I'm sorry, I didn't put in a lot of details, but just to give you a sense of the room where the Philando Castile painting was, you have next to it a Deanna Lawson photograph of a grandmother and her grandson, and the grandmother is holding a heart-shaped Valentine's candy box that her grandson has given her, and then a Henry Taylor painting of a backyard barbecue, and there were another 6 or so Henry Taylor paintings in this room, along with a number of other Deanna Lawson photographs, giving a very broad sense of African-American life in the country, so that the Philando Castile painting was part of this panorama, or this study of African-American life. Whereas within Schutz's body of work, and certainly within Schutz's presentation at the Whitney Biennial, there was no evidence that she was interested in Black experience beyond the spectacle of this one Black death. And I think that's what really allowed people to understand Henry Taylor's engagement with the subject matter as part of a larger concern with Black life and not just an interest in Black death. I see that I have now come to 45 minutes, and I know that you guys, usually ask questions and stuff like that, and I suspect that you'll have a lot of questions about what I've just talked about. So I think maybe I'll just turn it over, right? Thank you. Thanks. So does anyone want to start? Yes.
So my question is,
Yes.
has Diana not only just focused on just Emmett Till's death,
Yeah.
but went into the study of Black life as well? Do you think it would have been received differently? Or do you think she still would have gotten that you're a white person picking Black life and looking at it?
You know, I think genuinely, I think I'm sitting here and I'm blanking, and I should have examples at my fingertips, but there are artists who have depicted Black life, white artists who have depicted Black life, and it has not generated the same kind of controversy. I don't think it was just like, now this subject matter is all off limits. I think that for most people, there were kind of two issues. Another issue that I didn't get into was that, yes, this was an incredibly diverse biennial, but every biennial up until then had been like actually shockingly not diverse, right? And so the Whitney was coming in from a deficit, right? So it's like, okay, you've acted badly since 1973, and now this is your first time of doing something right. And, they were hoping that they'd get off the hook, like, oh, look, we finally changed our ways. And it's like, yeah, you've got a deficit of since 1973 to make up for, right? So I think that was, people were primed to kind of be suspicious of the biennial on that front. But I genuinely think that if it had been an artist who had engaged more in a more sustained fashion with the lives of the people whose history he or she was engaging with, that the reaction would have been quite differently. And to contrast it, I just want to raise another thing that happened this year at the Walker Art Center, which was the artist Sam Durant presented an installation, a piece that was actually placed in it was like a playground, like a play structure, but it was called scaffold. And it was actually made out of the scaffolds used to execute Native Americans on the Trail of Tears, right? And so this was, hugely charged. And the Native American community in Minnesota organized very quickly, and this is in the wake of the Dakota pipeline and everything like that. So there's already a kind of activism, publicly recognized activism around this. They organized very quickly, and here was an artist who has long engaged with this, this history and has tried to engage with the community. And what he did was extraordinary, which was to say, okay, tell me what I did wrong and tell me how we should fix it. And turned the process. He's an artist who we would call a social practice artist, right? An artist whose sort of work within the communities and within the histories that he engages is part of the work itself. And so he essentially turned that conversation into part of that work of Scaffold and negotiated with the museum and with the protesters about what to do with this piece. And the Native American elders who were brought in and asked by him to decide what to do with the piece are still debating how best to deal with it. Some people had called for its destruction. Other people don't want it destroyed because it is a physical artifact. But it turned into, the opposite of this. It turned into something that actually made the conversation happen, right? The Whitney, everyone, when they talk about controversial paintings, they say, oh, well, it's going to spark conversation. But then the conversation, where does it happen? It never happens, right? But here, Durant especially, and I admire him for this, Durant insisted that the conversation happened, and so it did happen. So I do think that it's not that you'll never have protest, and frankly, why should there never be protest if you're grappling with issues like this? But I think that in this case, it was Dana Schutz's refusal to kind of cede any ground, right? She had every right to make it. And, it was very complicated. She was calling up, a lot of people and, a lot of important Black people, right? And saying like, is it okay, should I show this painting? And they're saying, yeah, sure, it's free speech. Like Henry Louis Gates is saying that it's okay that I show this painting, right? And so when you have that, and when you have people, when you can point to people who are reinforcing your position, there's very little incentive to actually say, okay, well, Henry Louis Gates probably like has less, maybe he has less stake in it than this like 25-year-old black artist who can't put food in his mouth because, no one will, unless he's making pictures about lynching, no one will actually pay attention to him. Like, so maybe let's listen to what this person says, even if ultimately I don't agree with him. But she actually refused, this is terrible, she refused to take part in public events because she was so convinced that these young black artists, curators, and critics were actually going to be violent in the events, that there was no actual conversation. And that seems to me really, really, artists, have you met them? They're like not generally very violent. One or two, so it was a weird thing. So genuinely, I think the issue is, had she shown any commitment to the communities of the history, and the histories, that I think people are quite generous, and I think artists are quite generous. I think that this was really a very specific case. Most of her work deals with like sort of spectacular, like pop culture and stuff like this. Like her other painting in the biennial was a painting of a fight in an elevator, and it was part of a series based on, Solange and Jay-Z beating each other up, or Solange beating up Jay-Z in an elevator at the Metropolitan Museum. So that and Emmett Till's casket didn't really strike the right note together. Do you know what I mean? Okay. Other?
One thing I'll just add on to that, sorry.
Yeah.
Do you think that the reaction, had this been about a gay person,
Yeah.
she was straight and she had created an art piece about a gay person,
Yeah.
a victim of the Orlando shooting,
Yeah, sure.
do you think it would have been the same reaction that it got with Emmett Till, her being a white woman, like painting a black boy being murdered, or her being a white woman painting a gay person?
Sure.
Being killed?
Okay, so this is what I'll say, and this is a more complicated answer. And like, of course, like all of these hypotheticals are difficult to answer because they are hypotheticals, right? And like, as I said, like the Whitney thought that the Pope thing was gonna like piss people off, and that didn't piss people off, right? Like, so like they were running through the hypotheticals too, and they, didn't think that this was, that this is where they had to worry. I think that the difference, I don't know. I think that the difference is that gayness is much more present in the art world than blackness is, right? And so that, which is not to say that there's not homophobia in the art world. Like there totally is, and that's unquestionable. But gayness is more present in the art world. So I think that what was happening here, and with a lot of arguments about appropriation, right? Like, because, you've heard all the arguments about cultural appropriation, right? Like, like when it comes to Halloween costumes or fashion or, whatever. You've heard all the arguments. And I think ultimately what the arguments come down to is, don't appropriate my culture if you're not willing to let me in the door, right? Don't appropriate my culture, but then like leave me out, right? And I think that that's very much what's happening here, right? Like that this is not just, an appropriation of culture, but that this is an appropriation of culture by someone and within an institution that has not, like what a lot of my friends were saying, which cracked me up, is like, Dana Schutz didn't have the one black friend that she was going to go to and say, tell me for real, can I show this painting? Because that one black friend would have said, really? Like, do you really want to do that? Which is, whatever. A painter can paint whatever they want, right? But the question is what happens when something goes from a private articulation to a public one, to a public display, right? And so I think that when it went into public, it got interpreted along those terms. Like, yeah, it's okay. Like, you're going to have a white woman come in and show a painting of Emmett Till at an institution where you still don't have in your collection major figures in the history of art who happen to be black, right? Where you still don't have actually curators of color, right? Like where you still don't have, right, where your board is 100% white, right? Like so it's what I think is that it's never comes down to that dyad of who's the artist and what are they painting. It's always happening in a context, right? Maybe in their studio, that's what it comes down to. Maybe in your studio, it really is just like, I'm this person and I want to paint this thing and that's all that matters. But the minute that something leaves the studio, it enters into this whole field, right? Of debate and inequality and, you know, all of that kind of stuff. And so, yeah, so that's my sort of hedging answer to your question. Yes? Well, okay, so I'm going to answer your question by talking about one of these like sessions I had with the Whitney, the education staff, right? Because they, like, right after this whole thing blew up and like everything, like it was on CNN and it was on this and it was on that and it was like everyone knew about what was going on and they were stunned. They felt like they had been hit by a truck. And I went in and I sat and talked to them and they said, but we're doing something, like we're trying. And it's like, yeah, guess what? Like, I had a boyfriend once who was like actually a really awful guy and he would do terrible things and terrible things and terrible things. And then once he did something nice and it's like, yeah, it doesn't make me forget all the terrible things. Like, but if you keep doing nice things, maybe like I'll start forgiving you for all the terrible things, right? So like we're all operating, and I'm not a black person, right? So I also have like, I have my own experience of race in this country, but I don't experience it as a black person would. And so I think for all of us who are engaging with that history, right? We have to know that we're like, yeah, individually, like I may not have anything personally to answer for, but I'm operating in a country where all the systems are geared to benefit me or not, benefit some people more than others, right? So we are all operating in that system, and it does make things harder. And I think that in terms of speaking out or not speaking out, right? I think that it's the context, and I think that it's what I've realized is that listening first is hugely important, and speaking to my people, it's important, right? Like, so I always think of it as like the family dinner table conversation, right? Like it's not, I shouldn't be standing up at, on a stage at some protest and speaking out about how terrible things are for black people. I should be sitting down with my community and saying like, smarten the hell up, right? Like, stop with what you're doing, change your attitudes, right? And so I think that so part of it has to do with what you're taking, who you're listening to, right? So spending a lot of time listening to people who feel that they have been, or know that they have been, it's not just that they feel, know that they are in a position of systemic inequality, right? And making space for them to speak that, and then taking responsibility where you can. And that when one is engaging with history like this, do your homework, right? That it can't just be a one-off thing. It can't just be like, oh, guess what? I just heard this story on NPR about Emmett Till's mother, and I'm so moved by it, I'm going to make a painting, and then expect that there's not going to be blowback, which is essentially what happened here, right? She listened to this NPR program and was like, oh my God, that moved me so much, and painted a painting, and then was surprised when people were like, what are you doing, right? And I think that what may well have happened is that had she really read about the history she was engaging with, and not just reacted as a purely like personal, like, ooh, I feel something, let me put it on display at the biggest art exhibition in the US, right? Like that maybe, there would be some filtering between those two things. So I guess for me, I'm Canadian as well, right? So all of this history is something that I didn't grow up with, and I came here as a young adult, and I've had to learn, and really what's fascinating to me is America is a really weird place, and really weird when it comes to this history of race. And so I've really had to learn a lot, and I've had to read a lot, and I've had to pay attention a lot. And so I think that that's it. And I think that, even when I mess up, and I mess up all the time. The other day, I was like, I have a friend, an artist named Simone Lee, who's an amazing ceramic artist, black artist who deals with a lot of issues around black femininity and history. And we were on the phone, and I was like, Simone, I have discovered the most amazing skincare product that you have ever heard of. It's raw, unrefined shea butter, and it is the most amazing thing. And I went on for 5 minutes about shea butter and how it's changed my life and made my heels not crack anymore. And she was like, you mean shea butter like they sell at every bodega in Harlem in big blocks because every African American uses shea butter? And I was like, exactly, that's the one, right? And it was like I just shea butter-splained shea butter to a black person, and it was really embarrassing. But she laughed about it because she knows that I make the effort. Right? I make the effort, and I know the history, and when I realized that what I was doing, I could say to myself, okay, that was really stupid of me, and that was okay, right? And I think that it really comes down to building a track record, right? Like, so a lot of people, for all of these issues, and I'm sure you have issues too, like when it comes to questions of sexism or whatever issues that are, or classism, or whatever issues that you're interested, like that affect you personally. I'm sure that every once in a while someone will be like, oh my God, there's sexism in Hollywood. And you're like, really? It's just occurring to you now? Like, and like we all have that, right? And so that's what we sound like sometimes to people who have been living with this systemic and structural oppression for so long. Oh my God, there's racism. And it's like, yeah, we've been telling you that pretty much since 1609, right? Like, we've been telling you that, right? So so a lot of what we see as the frustration or the anger or the pushback is really people saying like, you haven't been listening for this long, and now you're finally listening, and you want a prize for it. And it's like, no, like you're lucky we're not like, kicking you off, voting you off the island for not having listened for so long, right? But we're all like, oh, look, like I'm great because I'm aware now, right? And so I think that's where a lot of it comes in. And for me, the other part of it is that I think that, my daughter and I live in a very, very, very white place, a village, and it's very white, very liberal, very white. And, we have a lot of friends who really genuinely want to understand what's going on when it comes to the racial divides in the country. And I say, okay, but and they say, like, we don't know how to learn. And I was saying, like, why don't you just talk to people, like, talk to your friends and stuff? Well, we don't really have friends that we can talk to. And then you start digging down and say, well, why don't you have any friends who are not white? Well, because, mainly I go to Dave Matthews Band's concerts or whatever it is, right? Like, I'm really into, like, folky Appalachian music or whatever. Like everyone just listens to music. All they do is go to concerts, and they're all these like really super white folk bands. And I was like, well, there's like a Bhangra concert at Masmoka down the road. Maybe you go there, and maybe your whole like part of this whole thing. And I think that's often hard for us to understand is like our worlds have to shift, right? And our social worlds even have to shift. And the music we listen to and the movies we like to go to and whatever, like you shift those things and all of a sudden like you're exposed to a whole different kind of world. And I think and that's the fun part of it, frankly. I mean, that's like, to me, that's not at all the difficult part of it, but it's like we often don't think of it because we think of those very personal decisions about what we like and who we like to hang out with as just like personal decisions, but it's all within this like larger field. So I think like don't make the mistake, if you're engaging with this as an artist or as a historian or a writer or whatever, don't make the mistake of not having that one friend who will say to you, okay, yeah, that was nice of you to do, but please don't show that to anyone because you'll get in trouble, kind of thing. Like that's the advice.